Okay. Um, so I think I'm live. Hi everyone. So in our last class, we talked about HTML. It was kind of like a wrap of HTML since we've been rushing through most of the things. And I'm going to just quickly run through some of the things that we talked about, and then we'll proceed to CSS, since this class is majorly on CSS. We talked about, I think I'll just pull up some of the things that we talked about in our last class. Let me do this. Okay, so we built a registration form in the last class. We built a registration form, and this form, we added a couple of fields. We talked about the form tag, we talked about the input label, and then other tags like the select tag. We talked about the buttons, and we linked the registration page to the login page, which we didn't really have the time to structure, but I've taken the time to add a couple of fields, just a basic login page. And we also planned to have a profile page, which is empty right now. I would have added some code, but I decided to leave it empty, so we'll go through the process together. And this is what we had in our last class. We had the registration form, first name, last name, every other thing, the gender, the country, date of birth, where we had to use the the date input type, and the checkbox and the button. Clicking on this link takes you to the login page, where it was empty in our last class, but now we have email and password, which I added. And when you click on the register link here, it will take you back to the registration page, or the registration form rather. So this class, I'm going to talk about CSS. I've talked about CSS before in the first class, where we just briefly talked about HTML and CSS. I'm going to talk about CSS, and I'll basically walk you down through the basics of CSS, and we'll use CSS a bit if you have some time. Of course, we'll use CSS. We'll try to design this registration form. I think in the last time we had like a template that we were meant to follow, but I think most importantly, we are going to handle CSS first, just basically talk about the basics, and then we'll get to designing this form. Okay. CSS. CSS stands for Cascading Style Sheets. CSS is a style sheet language used to control the presentation and layout of a web page written in HTML. So we've talked about CSS. You've been hearing CSS. You've been hearing CSS since this entire series started, right? CSS, we just basically use CSS to make web pages look beautiful. So it helps us to design the web page. And in retrospect, if I think about the example I gave the last time, so I used building a house. Yeah, I used the example of building a house. So you are building a house, you've structured everything, you've put the blocks together, you've even roofed the house, but you still can't move in because you've not actually beautified it, you've not painted, you've not done all the things that will make it look appealing. So I likened that process to using CSS to style a web page. You use HTML to structure the web page, then you use CSS to style it, to make it look beautiful, visually appealing, right? So that's basically what CSS is about. And CSS, there are three types of CSS. I'm going to talk about the three types. I'll talk about the anatomy of CSS, and then we'll go into the weeds of things, right? So there are three types of CSS. There's the inline CSS, internal CSS, and the external CSS. The inline CSS is it's basically CSS, but you use it in HTML. So This is how the inline CSS is used, where you use the style attribute and then you pass the style. What you are seeing here in green is the style that is being applied to the h1 tag, right? Don't bother about the content. I'm going to break that down soon. So this is how you use the inline CSS. It's called inline because the style is applied to the tag, that you want to style. So it's applied directly to the tag. That's why it's called inline, right? And every HTML tag that displays something. Why am I saying this? In the previously, I've always been talking about HTML tags that are concerned about the description of the page, tags that are in the header, in the tags that are in the head tag, sorry, tags that are in the head section of the page are not seen by the user, but tags that are in the body are seen by the user. That's what displays on the web page, right? So every tag that is in the body, that is supposed to be in the body, has a style attribute. And this style attribute, you can use it to like put inline CSS to style that particular element, right? So this is an example of how the inline CSS is used. And then the internal CSS is using the HTML style tag inside the head section. So this is just an example of how you use the style tag. So you have the HTML tag, you have the head, you have the body. So whatever goes into the body goes into the body. But if using internal CSS, you have to use the style tag and you define the CSS code inside the style tag. I'll get to the details of what this style is supposed to do, but this is how you add in internal CSS to a HTML file, right? Or how you use internal CSS in a HTML file. And then there's external. So the inline and internal CSS is kind of limited in a way that if you have several pages on your website has a lot of pages. Most websites do, right? You have a lot of pages like the registration form that we put together, the login and other pages like profile, whatever. Your you might have some styles that are kind of similar between these pages, right? So maybe you have how you designed your texts and how they are supposed to look, or your buttons or your form, whatever. And this style is supposed to exist in some other pages. So you want these pages to share the same style. If you use the inline CSS, which is this here, you will have to write it over and over again for all the pages that this particular style needs to be used, right? Same with the internal CSS. If you use the internal CSS, because both of them actually exist inside the HTML file, as you have seen in this example, you will have to rewrite same CSS over and over, which is a no-brainer because CSS actually has the external type where it allows you to basically write your CSS in another file and include that file in any HTML file that needs it, right? So that is done using the link tag, and the link tag is also supposed to be inside the head tag because you are using it to basically import a style file, right? Or a CSS file, however. So I'll just quickly run through. The link tag is simple, straightforward. So you have the link, and the rel here basically stands for relationship. So the rel attribute is used to describe or tell HTML the relationship between the HTML file itself and the file you are trying to, or whatever you are trying to bring into the HTML file. In this case, styles.css. You remember we've talked about HTML, and you've seen that HTML files have an extension of .html. So any file you create and you attach .html makes it a HTML file, right? Same with CSS. Any file you create and you add .css, which is the extension, it makes it a CSS file. So that's basically a valid CSS file. So in this case, we are importing styles.css, right? And um The rel here is style sheet. So HTML will know that we are trying to import a style. This link tag is supposed to be inside the head tag because it has nothing to do in the body. There's nothing you don't intend to show anything. You are just importing a file, right? So any style written inside this file here, inside the styles.css, will be applied to the HTML file that you imported it into. So if we have the registration.html and we import styles.css, any style we write in styles.css will be applied to registration.html. In our last class, I noticed it was later when I watched my video, I realized that my video was blocking a bit of the page. So now that I'm aware of that, I want to talk about the anatomy. And just to state, the comments should be open. Let me quickly confirm that. 1 second. Yeah, so the chat is open. The live chat is open. If you have any questions, and it's best for you to basically just type it in the chat right now if you don't understand anything. While I'm at this, if I see your question and I can get to it right away, I will. Else I'll get to it at the end of the class. Yeah, so I'm going to move my video over here like this. Okay, so I'll talk about this other part. So anatomy, the anatomy of CSS. We've talked about the types, the inline, internal, and external. Now we are going to talk about the anatomy of CSS, right? What is CSS made up of? What makes CSS a CSS? What makes CSS code, whatever, style? Sorry. Okay, so you can see here in the internal internal CSS that I wrote here. You see, I'm basically there's a tag or whatever, a selector here, braces, and then there are what we call properties and then values. So that's what CSS is made up of. CSS is made up of a selector, a property, and a value. The selector specifies which HTML element or elements the style applies to. In this internal CSS example, we are trying to style the h1 tag. Any h1 tag on the page, we intend to apply these styles to it. So we are using the tag to select what we want to style. I'm going to go into detail about selectors. I'm going to talk about selectors. I'm going to talk about the style, the types of selectors. But for now, I'm just basically explaining what selectors are. As the name implies, a selector is used to select what you want to style. So that's just it, right? So the property specifies what aspect of the selected element style to modify. So you selected an element from the HTML. You want to style something, an attribute or a property of that element. For example, if you pick a paragraph, a bunch of text, whatever, a paragraph, right? You can style the font, you can change the color, you can change the size. Those are all properties that you can modify to make that element look the way you want it to, right? So the property is basically what you use to specify the property you specify the element the selected element property that you wish to style or that you wish to modify, right? So the value is defines the specific setting for that property. So take property color of a text, right? The color is the property. The value of that color can be blue, green, red, whatever, however you want to, whatever color you want to use, right? So that's basically what the value in this sense stands for, right? So actually this is the end of my presentation. I don't have any other screens to show you because from here on out, I'm going to quickly talk about selectors by showing you how to use them, right? But before I do that, what I'm going to do is, let me drag this over here again. what I'm going to do is we'll style some of the things, some of the elements on our page using the inline CSS, and then we'll change that to the internal, and then we'll use the external so that you basically understand how these three types work and how important they are and when to use them, right? Very important when to use them. So I'll get back to our code. We have this rough registration page. We have the first name, last name, all the fields that we've defined. We want to apply inline CSS to some of the elements here so they look nicer, right? For example, this text here, I would like it to have a different font type. Right now, I think this is Times New Roman. Some of you that have used Microsoft Word before, you know a lot of fonts. This might be Times New Roman. It looks like that. I want to change this to Arial, and I probably want to change the size and the color too, so it looks nicer, right? How am I going to do that? I'll head to the HTML, which is register.html here, and I'll look for that that element, which is the sorry, that's a mistake, which is the h3 here, the registration form. It's the header 3 tag, right? So the h3. Something I actually wanted to say before styling this, and let me think about it for a second. Okay, we are going to change the font type, the font, we are going to change the color, we are going to change the size, right? Those are the three things we are going to do. And we are going to do that using the inline CSS. So, like I said, the inline CSS, you use the style attribute. Every HTML element that is supposed to be in the body has a style attribute that you can apply styles to, right? That you can apply styles with. So I'm going to type style here, which is the style attribute. And inside the style, I'll change the font family. So the attribute, the property for changing the font of an element is called font family. I'm going to talk about properties, so don't worry. Don't worry, I'll talk about properties, I'll talk about values. So I would say font family is Arial, and every CSS rule ends with a semicolon. So for your CSS to be valid, after you've written CSS, for it to actually reflect on the page, you need to end whatever rule you wrote with a semicolon. That's what will tell CSS that you are done for that particular property and you want to go to the next one, right? So my IDE has somewhat automatically added the semicolon for me, but you get the point. So I'll save this so we see the change right away, but then when I get back, I'll just add more styles. So I'll save this, and you've seen that the registration form has changed from Times New Roman or whatever it was to Arial. It looks more modern. I'm going to open up the login page on the side so that we'll see the difference. So this is how it looks. This is how it looked before. The registration looked like this before. Now it looks like this because we've changed the font style, the font family. There's something else called font style, so I mix them sometimes. So it's font family, don't get me wrong. So I want to change the size. Technically, you don't necessarily need to because it's a H3 tag, and H3s actually have their own size. So that's the difference between the different header tags, the size. So you have H1 to H6, all have different sizes. Remember, I talked about it before. But you can decide to change the size if you wish. So in this case, we'll change the size. You can see the attribute here, font size, the property rather. And I want to change this to, let's say, 32 pixels. I'm going to talk about fonts. I'm going to talk about font sizes and everything, so you have nothing to worry about. I just want to show you how inline CSS works, and then I'll get back to talking about the selectors, properties, and values again in detail. And then I'm going to change the color to let's say blue, right? So we've changed the font family to Arial, the font size to 32 pixels, and the color to blue. So when I head back, this is how it looks. Now it looks really, really big. Too big, actually. Too big. But you get the point, right? So this is how we use the inline CSS by applying it directly to the tag. Now, what I was trying to explain before was if I actually want this to be on the login page, I want this style to be on the login page, I actually have to copy it like this, go to the login page, and paste it where I want it to be. So I'm basically repeating the same thing, which is unnecessary because if I had an external CSS file, I just had to import it here. I wouldn't have to like write the style again, right? So I'll just take this back. And then let's say we want to style the button, the register button here. So I'm going to add another inline style, and let me see. I want this to have a background color of red and a text color of white. This is our button here. It looks ugly, of course, but yeah, our style has been applied, right? So I'm going to move this and create an internal CSS. Right now, this is inline CSS. I'm going to make it an internal CSS so you actually see how that works too. But before I do that, I'm going to talk about selectors so you understand, because the reason why I don't talk about selectors is because I've not actually used selectors yet. But I'm going to talk about selectors now, and you in detail you understand exactly what they are and what they mean, what they do, right? To do that, I'm going to create a new file here. So as explained before, you use the selector to get the elements that you wish to style, right? So there are different types of selectors. There are some very complex selectors, some selectors that involve you thinking of mathematics, whatever. But they are very common selectors, the one that you find almost everywhere. If not, you find everywhere. Every website you go to actually have these selectors because they're very common and easy to remember, easy to use. So yeah, so we have the ID selector, we have the class selector, we have the tag selector, and then we have the attribute selector. Right, let me increase this. It's really big now. So we have the ID selector, the class selector, the tag selector, and the attribute selector, right? Every HTML element can have an ID attribute and a class attribute. The ID attribute, I've talked about this before, but I just ran through it in my previous classes. The ID attribute uniquely identifies a HTML tag. If you give an HTML tag an ID, no other tag is supposed to have that ID. That's why it's supposed to be a unique identifier, right? The class, on the other hand, can be shared. A lot of HTML elements can have one class. It's fine. The tag is basically what we've talked about. So we have a lot of tags. I'm going to show you how to use the tag selector. The attribute selector, you can use the value, the value of an attribute in an element to select it. So let me show, I'm going to show you how to use these 4 common types of selectors in our inline CSS. And I'll start with the ID selector. The first thing I'm going to do is I'll remove the style that we've already written for this. Let me do this. I'll remove the style that we've already written for this our header. I'll just cut it, save, so we see that it's back to how it was before, right? Okay, so remember in my presentation I talked about the internal CSS, that's you have to use the style tag and it has to be inside the head section. That's exactly what we are going to do, right? So inside the head tag, I'm going to add the style tag inside the head section. I'm going to add the style tag here, and I'm going to use the ID. Now, mind you, there's no element here in our page that has an ID, so we have to give an element, the element that we want to style, an ID, right? And you can give an element any ID you want, whether it's a number, whether it's a text, whether it's someone's name. An ID can be anything as far as it's unique, right? So our H3 tag here that has the registration form, I'm going to give it an ID. So just like we define attributes in HTML, this is exactly how you go do it. So ID, let's say I'll name it form title. Like I said, an ID can be anything. I can decide that it's form space title. I can decide that it's form camel case title. So however I wish to basically define, I can say it's form title 18, but it's actually advisable to use IDs that make sense. So if someone looks at this element, they see the ID, they know exactly what it is, right? So this is form title. By standard, it's best to keep your IDs like this. So if it's basically if you have a couple of words, it's best to use hyphen or dash to separate them. So form title, just by standard, it makes sense to write, to give this kind of IDs, because that's what most people do. That's what is done in the web space basically. So how am I going to select this element using the ID selector? I'll use the hash. Using the hash and the ID of that element, I've been able to select the element. Wherever you see hash in CSS and something follows it, you know that's an ID selector. So hash ID, right? So hash form title. We've defined the ID here, and this is us selecting the ID or selecting the element using its ID. If I did not use hash, it will mean something else. This is not actually going to work. This is an error, but it's just that CSS will not tell you that it's an error. It will just not work at all, right? So you have to use the hash if you are selecting an element using its ID. I'm going to paste our style here. Just take this bit out. Sorry, just to structure it a bit. Okay, so same thing we did before for the inline CSS, but now we are using the ID attribute, the ID selector, to select this our H3 tag and applying the font family, font size, and color. I'll save this, and you see that our title has been styled. Again, we are 30 minutes down. Our title has been, time runs so fast. I'll quickly go through what I intend to. I think we still have time. Okay, so you've seen that our title has been styled using the internal CSS. So we use the ID selector and we passed our style. Like I explained before, you have to tell CSS that you are done with a rule or a line by adding a semicolon at the end before you proceed to the next line. If you don't do that, it will not work. If you don't do that, the style will not be applied. So if I take this semicolon out, I think my ID will add it back. Of course, it will auto-correct it. Okay, let me remove it from here. Yes. So you've seen that I've removed the semicolon from the font size. CSS will not apply this color because it doesn't know, it doesn't like it still thinks this is like, it still thinks I'm not done with this line because I've not added a terminating character. The terminating character in CSS is semicolon, right? So if I save this, by the way, my ID has already highlighted that there's something wrong. You can see it as basically semicolon expected. This is, I think VS Code should come with this by default. You can see that it's telling me exactly why this style will not work with proper detail, right? If you don't have this by default on your VS Code, I can't really remember if it comes by default. Download, I think you should download this extension. It's Prettify, right? Prettify, is it? I'm not sure. You know what? I'll check. I'll probably talk about it in the next class, or I'll make a video within the week and mention it. But that aside, back to the page, you can see that only the font size was applied, only the font family was applied. Even the font size was not applied, the color was not applied. Whatever comes before the error will work. Whatever comes from the error down will not work, right? So if I add the semicolon back, it will apply the style again. Yeah. So that is the ID selector, hash ID. Boom, you've gotten it. Over to the next selector here, the class selector. And this is what we're going to do. So let's identify a couple of things here that we want to give a class, and then we'll style that class. So let's look at this attribute. This is the label of our input, right? This is the label here. We are going to give all, or better still, I think, don't worry, we'll not use the label. Let's use the maybe we should use the label so we can. Okay, let's use the label. Sorry, I just got a bit confused there. Let's use the label. So we have a couple of labels here, and we are going to give them a class, and then we will use the class selector to style them. So let me quickly, I'm going to, because of how many labels we have here, I'm just going to actually select all of them at once, since we are giving them the same class. Or I think better still, I'll give some labels a different class, some labels another class, so it explains my point. So I'm going to give the first name and last name a class. If you are wondering how I was able to select two lines or multiple lines at once and write exactly the same thing, I don't know how it's done on Windows, but if you are using Mac OS, if you click on the Option key and you select a line, you select another line, it's going to basically allow you to edit both lines at the same time. It's not important. It's just something that you might be wondering how I was able to do. It's just a minor trick that a lot of people use. So I'm going to give now the name of a class can be anything too. So you can give class names. Class names can be numbers, can be text, whatever, people's names, whatever you want to give them. I'll name this class name, or user, let's say user name, right? So I've created a class, and the class I've added a class attribute to the first name and the last name labels, right? And the name of the class is username, right? So I'm going to use the class selector to style these labels using their class names. So let's copy this name and head back to where we wrote our style. This is how you use the class selector. You use a dot and the class name. So attribute selector, ID selector, hash, class selector, dot or full stop, whatever. So wherever you see dot, whatever dot something, know that in CSS, know that that's a class. The person is trying to use the class selector. So this is how the class selector works. Everything that has this class, anything you write, any style you write in this block will be applied to it. In this case, these are the labels that we are targeting here, the first name and last name labels. So I'm going to quickly, what will I do? I think I'll change their color. So I'll change the color to red, and I want them to be bold, right? So I'm going to give them font weight. I'll talk about don't worry, I'll talk about most of these properties, font weight, font family, so you don't get confused. So I'm going to give it font weight of, let's say, 600, so it's really bold. When I save this and go back, you see we have just the first name and last name labels. Color change to red. They look bolder than than all the labels here. I'm going to change the font. Maybe I'll change the font family to something like Arial. There are other font families that we can use. I'm going to explore those in a couple. So I've changed the font family. We have first name, last name, yeah, and the rest of the labels that don't have the username class are not styled. So that's basically how the username attribute, username, the class selector works. And mind you, like I mentioned, any element you give an ID has to have that ID alone. You cannot share an ID, but you can share a class. So I can decide to take this class and apply it to another label, like the email, for example. I'll take it out. I'm just trying to show you an example. If I save it, the email will have exactly the same style that was applied to the first name and last name because I've given it the same class, right? And an element can take multiple classes. So an element can take as many classes as possible. But what is important to remember is if a class has a style and you give it another class that is basically styling that same thing. So if one class is styling the color, is changing the color to blue, and the second class that you give it is changing the color to white, based on CSS hierarchy, it will most likely be white. It will be white actually, because that's the latest style that was applied to it. I think I missed talking about hierarchy in CSS. So um, CSS has a hierarchy of style application. And that hierarchy, if you are styling the ID, if you are directly styling the ID of selecting an element by its ID in CSS and styling it, anything beyond that, anything below that, whether it's the tag selector, the class selector, all the styles, the ID is going to override those styles as far as you have exactly the same properties. So for example, if I take this username class, and I apply it to this registration form title, say I give it username, right? Now, before we get to the browser, this is what is going to happen. Definitely, it's going to still be font family is going to be Arial. It's going to be bold because there is no font weight here. But what is not going to change is the color. The color is still going to be blue, even though in the class the color is red. Why? Because ID, the ID of an element has more importance than the class. So CSS is going to treat whatever is in the ID as more important than what is in the class. So the ID has a higher level of precedence than the class, right? So you can see it's still maintaining blue despite the fact that we've applied the same class as we did to these labels. That's because the color that is being applied here is applied through the ID selector. So the class selector does not have, is not as important as the ID selector. So whatever is in the ID selector is what will be applied here. Unless what you are defining in the class selector is not in the ID selector. I don't know if that makes any sense. I'm going to quickly move so that we don't dwell so much on this. I'll talk about external CSS and then properties. Okay, so I'll take this back a bit. And then we've talked about the ID selector, we've talked about the class selector. Now we'll talk about the tag selector. The tag selector is when you use the tag of an element to style it. So let's pick an element here. Let me pick an element. Our button, yeah, our button. So remember, we added this background color and the text color to our button. I'm going to remove it. And when I save, you see the button is back to how it was before. Now this is what I'm going to do. I'll not add a class to it. I'll not add an ID. I'm going to use the button tag to select it, right? So here I'm going to put button. If you are using the tag selector, you don't need any prefix. You don't need a hash. You don't need a dot. You don't need anything. Just type the tag that you want to style. But styling a tag can be dangerous because on your page you might have a lot of buttons and you probably don't want all the buttons to look the same. So that's why most times it's good to use either the class or the ID. It's not like using the tag is bad, but you have to know what you are doing so you don't mess the style of other elements that have the same tag, right? The other elements with the same tag. So this is how you select an element with its tag. No prefix, no dot, no hash, nothing. So I'm using button here, and I'm going to paste our style. So we have background color and color. Before I save this, remember the button looks like this, right? When I save this, this is how it looks like. So our style has been applied using the tag selector because we selected the button using its tag. And you can select any element using their tag. I can change this to label, for example. If I change this to label, all the labels on the form are going to have red background and white text. You see, right? Red background, white text, red background, white text, all the labels. That's because I used the tag selector to select them and apply a style. Why are these red? Like everything is red. It's because the tag selector is important, but it is not as important. It's kind of, I think, let me think about this for a second. Yeah, the class selector takes precedence. So the class selector is more important than the tag selector. So ID, class, tag, right? ID, class, tag. There are other types of selectors with their own level of importance, but the common ones are the ones I'm talking about. So whatever style is applied to a tag, if you apply the same style with a different value to a class, the class is going to override the tag. And if you apply the same property with a different value for an ID, the ID is going to override the class and the tag. So you can see here that the label has color white. All the labels that don't have this username class they have a text color of white and a background color of red. But all the labels, which is the first name and last name that have the username class, they still maintain their red color because CSS is going to prioritize class over the tag, right? So that's why they are like this. They are still here, but they just have red color, as I've highlighted and you are seeing here now. So I'm going to change this back to button. So we've styled our button, we've styled our header, we've styled our labels. These are not great styles, of course, but I mean, I'm just explaining the concept. I think at the end of the class, we should have already styled this form to look like a nice form. When I've talked about a couple of concepts like the box model and some other things. So here we have the tag selector, we have the class selector, and we have the ID selector, sorry, the class selector and the tag selector, right? So now we are going to quickly talk about the attribute selector, which is a bit more tricky than this or the other selectors I've talked about. But yeah, so how does the attribute selector work? With the attribute selector, you can select elements that have a particular attribute and a particular value, right? So let me look for something here. So watch this. I want to style all the attributes all the inputs that have let me see. Okay. I think I'm looking for the calendar. Okay, yeah. So I want to style all the inputs that have type date. I'm going to copy this type date. I want to style all the attributes, all the inputs that have the attribute type and the value date, right? So this is how I'm going to do it. I will use the tag. You can use any selector with an attribute. I'm going to explain. I'm going to show you, but I have to explain a bit. You can use any selector with an attribute. So in this case, I want to use the tag selector. So I'll use input, which is the tag. And for me to apply an attribute or to apply the attribute selector to this input, I will use the square brackets. Inside the square brackets, I will I will add the attribute and the value. This here is not basic CSS per se, but I just thought it's worth mentioning. There are a lot of ways you can use selectors. You can select the sibling of elements. You can select the children of elements and style them. However, you can use math to style elements, to select and style elements. But I just thought I should mention this just to give you an idea of how broad and large CSS can be, and how, I think most importantly, the fact that you have to consistently use CSS to know it. That's basically why. So you can use a selector, and you use the square brackets and pass an attribute and a value to select that particular element that is an input. So in this case, we are selecting all the inputs that have type date, and we want to, let's say we want to give them a background color of green, right? So you can see here there are a lot of their inputs here. These are all inputs. This is a text input, email input, password input, number input, but it's getting only the date input and changing the background color to green. That's because we are explicitly selecting inputs with type date. So that's exactly how the attribute selector works. I could change this and use label, but it's not going to work because there's no label that has attribute of type date, right? I could use dot username. Now, what am I trying to show you? I'm trying to show you that I can use any attribute, any selector type out here, and pass an attribute to it in order to select any element that is in that selector matches, that have that particular attribute value. So this is some complex stuff, and I'm going to end here so it doesn't confuse you. But you get the idea. So yeah. So that's that about selectors. We've talked about the ID selector, the class selector, the tag selector, and the attribute selector, right? You guys can actually leave questions in the chat since we are getting to the end of the class. So I can get to them if you have any questions. If all these things I've been talking about, any of them has not been clear in any way, or you are confused, or you have a random question not directly related to what I've been talking about since, fine. You can ask it in the chat. The chat's open. So we've talked about the ID selector, class selector, attribute selector, and the tag selector. This is inline CSS, right? If I want this style to be applied to the login page, I still have to copy it over to the login page. I cannot use it. I cannot write one style and use it in the login page. I don't know if that makes sense. So that's one kind of downside of inline CSS and internal CSS, because they are limited to the specific HTML file or page that you are working with, right? So for me to use this style, I have to copy it over to the login.html, which would be kind of unnecessary because I could have just used external CSS to do it. It's not like they are useless, don't get me wrong. There are times when you might just want to use this, for example the inline CSS. If you just quickly want to style this element and you don't really care, you don't really want that style to be somewhere else, you can use inline CSS. For those of you that will continue with this whole thing, because like I said, I point you the right direction, you study to kind of get used to this, right? To know how to understand how these things work. You actually use HTML and CSS to the point where you realize that there are other ways of doing things, and sometimes there are libraries too, but it's best to understand the basics before you get into those other things. So before I jump into properties, I'm just going to quickly use the external CSS. So we are done with CSS types. Then we head to the anatomy of CSS and basically break it down. So I'm going to create a file. I'll call it styles.css. Remember I said the extension of CSS files are .css, right? So any style I apply, I put here. If I import this CSS file in any HTML file, those styles are going to be applied to it. This helps us to reuse CSS styles. right? So if I'll cut all the styles that we've written, I'll cut them like this, and I'll take out the style tag, and I'll come here and paste them, right? So we've moved our CSS to an actual CSS file, right? I'll save this. Now the registration page will not have any style at this point because we've not imported the file. So you can see that the form is just back to normal, how it was before. I'm going to import the file by using the link tag. For the benefit of those that are not here initially, I know I'm going to share the video later, but just to so you don't get confused here. We talked about three types of CSS: the inline, the internal, and the external. And I've showed an example with the inline, the internal, and now I want to use the external CSS, right, where we import a CSS file into HTML. So we are going to use the link tag, and the relationship between this HTML file and the file we are importing is a style sheet, right? And the href is not a new attribute. We've used href before when we did links. So when we did the anchor tag, where is it now? 1 second. When we did the anchor tag, remember we used href. So href is not um it's not strange. It's not a strange attribute. So the href is going to be styles.css. So the href basically, with the href, you are basically telling HTML where to find what you intend to import, right? This can be in a folder somewhere. I think that it will be best for me to show you how it will look like if it's in a folder, because some people get confused a lot about this for some reason. So instead of creating this file out here, I'll create a new folder, and I'll title the folder CSS, right? And then I'll move this our styles.css inside the folder, right? So now instead of just typing styles.css, I'll type CSS, the folder, slash the file name, styles.css. So if this styles.css was in other folders, like maybe 4 folders from the HTML file, I would use all the folders. Are actually explicitly specify the folders before I try to import the file, because HTML will not be able to find the file if you don't tell it where the file is, right? So that's the point of this. I'll save this, and when I head back, you see that all our CSS here will be applied to the register.html file. You see, the file has actually taken form. It has basically reflected our CSS. But the login form still looks normal. It still looks like the regular login form. That's because we've not imported the CSS file in the login page. So we are going to copy this and go to login.html inside the head section, and we'll paste it, right? So notice something. I wrote one CSS, but I can apply it to as many files as I want to. That's the beauty of external CSS. I'll save, and if I head to the login page, okay, sorry, there's a problem here. I'm going to address it real quick. The login page only styled the button, and there's a reason. That's because in our CSS we are styling the button using the tag selector. We are styling the labels using the class selector, and we are styling the header using the ID selector. But we've not actually given the login h3 ID, and we've not given these labels classes. So the style is not going to show, right? So this is what we are going to do. Just like we have on the registration page, you can see here, the h3 has an ID called form title. We are going to copy it, and we'll paste it here, right? And for the labels that have the class username, these are the labels that have the red color and bold text and Arial font family. I'm just going to apply it to the email alone. I'll leave the password the way it is. So when I save this, you see, since I applied the class to the email label alone, only the email label was styled. The login form title, since I gave it an ID, form title, the style has been applied, right? So That's basically how external CSS works. You write a CSS file and you import it in any HTML you want it to be applied to. So that's that for CSS types. I'll talk about properties. I have a couple of minutes, so I'll just quickly round up. So we talked about the selector, the property, the value, and I'm going to talk about selector types. The types of selectors that we have in CSS. I'll just talk about them, show them, talk about them, show them. Most importantly, I've attached a couple of resources, I think 2 or 3 in the description of this video. I've attached about 3 resources, and I'd advise you to read up, right? I'll advise you to read up these resources. I think one from MCDN. I can't really remember. Mozilla, and then another one from let me quickly check. I'm not sure. Forgotten. W3 schools. Sorry, W3 schools and MDCN. I don't know if it's MDCN. I've forgotten. It's the Mozilla website for tutorials. So both of them actually lead you to CSS resources that talk about everything that I've talked about and even more, right? So since our next class is going to be on Saturday next week, I'll advise you to practice everything I've talked about, everything I've shown you, even read further, right? Because that's the best way to learn. You read up and you practice yourself. And in our next class, I'm going to continue with CSS, but I'm not going to spend as much as I have as much as I have spent talking about as long as I have spent talking about everything, because everything here, because this is the intro to CSS class. So I have to calm down and talk about the basics so you understand. But in our next class, I'll be using a couple of things and assuming that you have read up on some of those things because they'll be basic. Back to properties. I'm going to talk about a couple of properties and their values. I'll talk about the color property. So the color property basically specifies the color of text. The color you want a text to have, you use the color property to do it. You can actually use colors that you know, like blue or red or white, black, whatever, right? But in reality, that's highly limited. That's highly limited because you might need a particular color that doesn't even have a name. so so that's where you have to use um hexadecimal numbers. And I'm going to show you how it's used. You can use hexadecimal, RGB, or HCL. The most common are hex and RGB. Right now I've been using words so you don't get confused. I think it would be best, instead of me to rush through hex colors, I'm going to leave it for our next class. I think it will be the first thing I'll talk about. So I'll take my time and break it down. A lot of people get confused about that too. So, but for now, just to keep it simple, we'll be using colors that we know, like blue, red, and whatever, white. That's for the color. Font size, if you wish to change the size of text, you use the font size property to do that, right? So font sizes or sizes in CSS and HTML are measured most commonly in what we call pixels. So pixels, right? Most commonly pixels, represented as px. Wherever you see px, anywhere it's pixel. So that's a pixel, right? We also use points, which is represented by pt. It's not very common to see points, honestly. Most of the time you see pixels, px. There's rem, there is M, which you learn to use later when you go deep into CSS. I'll not talk about them, but they are basically relational, or basically relative size types. So if you have defined the basic or default text size, for example, if you've defined the default text size to be 10 pixels, if you now use if you have defined it in the root of your CSS, right? 1M would be 10 pixels. So when you use 2M somewhere, it means 10 times 2. So 20 pixels. So I'll not talk about them so you don't get confused. So we'll be using pixels everywhere because that's basically the standard, not the standard like the most common unit of measurement, both for for sizes and font sizes and maybe the sizes of other elements. So not only font sizes. So anything that has to do with size, we'll be using px for simplicity. So 32px is 32 pixels. It ranges from 0 to whatever number you wish it to be. So if I change this to 2 pixel, we go back to the form. Our login form or registration form text is going to look really small. Our form title, you can see it looks extremely small, so small you probably can't see it. That's because 2 pixels is really, really small. 12 pixel itself is small too, honestly, as compared to what you are used to. The reason why it looks kind of big to you is because I zoomed the page in. If I zoom this out, let me take it to the regular reset. See how small 12 pixel looks? So small you almost cannot see it. I'll take this back to the zoom I used so it's clear. So I'll use, if I change this to 1000 pixels, it will take the entire the entire page. So I can't even see whatever I'm doing here because it has basically zoomed everything out. So I'll zoom out. It's too big. It's too big. It has basically covered the page. I'll change it to, let's say, 100 pixels so it makes sense. So you can see how the difference in size between 100 pixels and the rest. So that's basically how you use pixels in CSS. I'll zoom this page back to 250. Yeah, so 100 pixels is really big. So I'll change this back to what we used before, 32 pixels. Usually you don't know exactly what you want it, the size you want, but as you keep experimenting, especially if you keep writing CSS, styles just become kind of like a natural thing that comes to you. Size. So when you use size, you know exactly how the text looks like. And then font family. Yeah, so if you want to change the font family of a text, use the font family property to do it. Most of the time, your computer has some default fonts like Arial, Times New Roman, Cursive, and some of those very common fonts that you find on like Microsoft Word and the rest. But there are a lot of fonts that your computer will not have, or the web server that your website is hosted on will not have. And most of the time, those are the style, the font size, the fonts families that actually make sense, the ones that you like, right? So I could change this to, let's say, cursive. I don't have cursive here, unfortunately. I have monospace. So let me use monospace. So this is how it looks like. The font style has changed. I can use any font style I want, but you have to import those font styles. You can either import them if you have the font files. Some of you may have seen files like TTF before, and there are some other font extensions, but yeah, if you have the local font sizes, a font styles, you can font families, you can import them, or you can use some that are free online. Like if you Google fonts, so Google has a free collection of fonts that you can use. So if I go to Google Fonts, you see a lot of fonts here, beautiful fonts that we can use. Let me see. This one looks kind of stylish, but it looks like it looks cartoonish in a way. Google will show you how to use this font in your web page. So if I click on get font, I can see get embedded code. If I want to embed the font in my style, in my, sorry, this one I did not add it. If I want to embed the font, if I want to import it to my web page, I can use the get embedded code button. Or if I want to download the local file and import it locally, I can do that. I'm going to get embedded code. So Google has given me this here. You can see 3 links that I'm going to import. I'm going to put in my HTML. So I'll import this particular font family. And this is how I'm going to use it in my CSS. Rubik vinyl or vinyl, whatever. Rubik vinyl. So I'm going to copy this. I didn't have to do this, but I just had to show you so you basically get an idea of how the font family works. So I'll copy this and paste it in my head section for my registration. So this is the code I copied from Google Fonts. I'll save it and I'll come here and change Mind you, this is not a system recognized font family. So you have to use colon if there's space. Not even only if there's space, just use colon for fonts that you imported from somewhere else or you downloaded, custom fonts. So I'm going to look exactly how Google wants me to use this Rubik vinyl. I'll copy it and I'll paste it. When you are using, I've pasted it. I'll go back to the page so you see how it looks. But let me just talk about this for a second. When you are using links, external links, like the one I just copied from Google now, it requires me to have my internet on in order to have that font family show on my page. But if I didn't want to do that, I could have just downloaded the file and imported it, which I'm not going to do. When you start dealing with fonts later down the line, you actually start using local fonts. So I'll go back to our page and see our form. Our registration form title has changed to this exact font that we downloaded from, that we imported from Google's website, right? So that's basically how you can use external fonts from like other sources. So Google has a rich collection of these fonts. Some are really stylish, like this one. So you can basically get most of the fonts that look beautiful here and use them in your websites. So I'm going to take this back to how it was before. So that's for font family. You can add as many font families as you want to. For example, if maybe my internet was disconnected and I was used to use that Google Rubik vinyl, and maybe if I wanted to show something else before the font loads from the internet or from Google's website, I can add a comma and I add Arial here as an alternative or a fallback font. So I can have a lot of fallback fonts. I can have Helvetica, sans serif, whatever. I just have to separate them with commas. And if I go back to the page, I'll definitely not see this Rubik vinyl because I've removed it from our HTML, remember. But I'm going to see Arial because that's the backup or the fallback font. So that's what, sorry, that's what you can see here now. This is registration form. It's showing Arial because Rubik vinyl does not exist, or it's not available at the moment, right? Because we've removed it. So I'm going to switch back. I'll just quickly run through these other types. These other properties. We've talked about color, font size, font family, font weight. So font weight, you basically use font weight to determine the boldness a of any text. So font weight ranges from 100 to 900. So but not 100. So basically in hundreds, it's in hundreds. It ranges from 100 to 900. So 100, 200, 300, 400, down to 900. So if I change this to 100, by default, text in HTML have font weight of 400 by default. Too. Anything above 400 will make it look bolder. Anything below 400 will make it look thinner. So if I put 100, it's going to look really thin. I'll leave this like this for now. I'll add it here so that it's more visible. So font weight, I'll make 100, right? It's going to look really, really thin. See, it looks thinner, way thinner than what it has actually applied here too because we are using external CSS. So any change I make to the file changes everywhere I use the file. So you can see it even looks thinner than the labels. So if I increase this to 300, it will look bolder, right, in a way. If I change this to 400, it looks normal. But if I changed it to 900, it will look really bold. But that's it, 100 to 900, and it's in hundreds. So that's basically font weight. Font weight ranges from 100 to 900. So I used 600 here, for example. 600 is like bold, really bold for normal text. Then what again did we use? Okay, we've talked about all the attributes all the properties that we used. I'm not going to talk about any other property. I think in our next class, when we talk about still basically continue where we talk about CSS and other parts of CSS, other things in CSS, we are going to use properties. And when I introduce a property, I'm going to explain what it does since we basically talked about the basic ones for now, right? So yeah, what again? I think we basically covered the types and the anatomy. We've talked about the property and value. So I'm sure now we have basic knowledge of CSS, how it works, how to use it, types of CSS. I think we've come to the end of the class. Since we don't have any question, I'm looking at the chat now. I'll just end the class here. I'm going to share the video in case maybe you need to revisit and on basically go through something that you missed, or you are trying to practice and you need to remember something I talked about. It's fine. I'm going to post the video and share the link. And thank you for joining. Catch you next week. Bye.